Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Women, Peace, and Security, Practical Guidance on Using Law to Empower Women. Thank you so much for joining Wand and Will for this presentation. My name is Udzi Vokiwa. I am the Senior Program Associate at Wand, and I will be running the technology today. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees are going to be muted during the presentation. Please submit your questions for our presenters by typing them into the questions section of your panel on the right-hand side of your screen. I will ask those questions out loud to our presenters after the presentation ends. If you're having any technical difficulties, please contact GoToWebinar directly at 1-800-263-6317. Now I'm going to turn it over to WAND's Women, Peace, and Security Policy Director, Julie Arostegui. Julie?
Thanks, Udzi. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and happy Women's Equality Day. Thank you for joining us as we look at ways that we can continue to advocate for gender equality, both at home and abroad, specifically by using law to empower women. Just a brief overview, I'm going to be presenting for a little bit on our new resource, which is the Women, Peace, and Security Toolkit that gives practical guidance on using law to empower women. And then we have a special guest from Uganda, Nageeba Hassan, who will talk about her work with Muslim and interfaith communities. And Minnesota State Representative Carly Melin will then be talking about some recently passed legislation in Minnesota, so we can bring it home and look at some efforts that are being made here in the U.S. So I think it's really important for all of us to keep in mind that law and human rights principles are something that everyone can use, not just lawyers. We have a very strong framework now around women, peace, and security, but the key is to know it and to be able to leverage it. And this recently published toolkit looks at ways to do that and gives practical guidance for all audiences. I just want to briefly, before I talk about it, just show where you can find the toolkit. Here on my screen you can see WAND's homepage. If you go to Our Issues and then go to Women, Peace, and Security, you'll see the drop-down menu. And you go to the Women, Peace, and Security Toolkit page. Here we go, it's popped up, and if you scroll down, you can see you can download the toolkit here, as well as the supplemental case studies. And just a very brief background on this. Get back to this here. This project, there we go. On this project, I worked with a partner in Uganda. We were working in the Great Lakes region. We did case studies of Uganda and Rwanda, two countries that have gone through great conflicts, but have also made a lot of inroads in their post-conflict systems, and women have been very important parts of those processes. So we talked to groups there to really go behind the scenes and look at how groups used international frameworks and national obligations to advocate for constitutions, for laws, for justice systems that included gender perspectives and women's rights, and how they are being implemented. And then we were also working with groups in South Sudan and Sudan as they were going through their processes of constitution writing and building their legislative and justice systems, so really applying that. And all of that knowledge and experience has gone into this toolkit. So I do also want to note that although it's focused on these case studies we did, it's also uses our experiences, and it's really applicable across the board in conflict situations, in conflict areas in the Great Lakes region, but also other areas, and also even as we'll see as we're looking at efforts here in the U.S. It's a really great resource for everybody. So I just look at some of the recommendations that came out of the toolkit. One is to know the framework. The more the citizens at all levels advocate and remind their governments of their obligations, the more they will become reality. So again, people at all levels knowing the law and being able to leverage that is really key. The second one is linking gender equality and women's rights to development and stressing the role of development and security. So looking at really practical measures, human rights are important and the basis for our advocacy, but it's been really important in recent years to look at the role of women in gender equality and development and how we all benefit when women are included in all of our efforts and can contribute to economies. So really using those kinds of practical strategies. Number 3 is advocating for a holistic and specific set of laws that address gender equality and women's rights. And we'll see that this toolkit really goes through the kind of laws that we need to look at and to have in place. Number 4 is harmonizing justice systems, empowering them to address gender issues. I'll touch on this briefly later, but I won't get into it too much today. But in a lot of conflict-affected countries, the justice system is, really not functioning. And there's a state justice system and customary traditional justice systems that are working. So there's a need to harmonize those and empowering them to address gender issues, which is really important everywhere. Even, for instance, here in the U.S., training judges and lawyers and creating a judicial system that understands and knows how to address these issues. And the 5th is working with communities, which means not only working at the level of law and policy, but also working at the grassroots level to educate people on their rights and to change the cultural and institutional perceptions that have allowed discriminatory practices to persist. So really taking a holistic approach to rule of law. Part 1 of the toolkit is a primer on the Women, Peace, and Security framework. Throughout the years, through various trainings that I've been doing in my work, I thought it would be really useful to really lay out this framework and what it means. So the toolkit looks at the international framework, which includes the United Nations Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security, the international laws that these include, some of the regional instruments that can be very useful, and using the international and regional instruments. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the UN Security Council resolutions. I know we've had other webinars and certainly available to talk more about this with everyone, but the basis of a lot of this work is UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and subsequent resolutions, which really recognize the effects of conflict on women and children and the need to look at things from a gender perspective, and also the need to include women. So the participation in protection and prevention efforts, and also mainstreaming gender into all efforts related to conflict resolution and peace building. And I think it's really important to understand that these resolutions call at all times for all parties in conflict to respect all international law applicable to the rights of and protection of women and girls. So again, really remembering that we're talking about a body of law that exists that these Security Council resolutions are referring to. And they also recognize the importance of rule of law as one of the key elements of conflict prevention, peacekeeping, conflict resolution, and peace building. Just briefly, the toolkit does go through all the international laws because, again, the Security Council resolutions really are a compendium of the international laws that we need to be looking at. And when you're working in different countries, you have to be aware of what treaties the countries have signed, but some of these are universal, and all countries are part of the United Nations. So it's really important to know what these laws are. And they're just listed out here: the United Nations Charter, the International Bill of Rights, which includes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. As far as women's rights, most of us know about the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is one of our most powerful tools. But again, we have all of these other instruments: humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, which address conflict, and most recently treatment of civilians in conflict, and recognizing the need to address the effects on women and children. We have several international laws related to sexual and gender-based violence, including the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which tries the highest level perpetrators of war crimes, and has recognized that rape and sexual violence can be war crimes, crimes against humanity, and forms of genocide. Then we have the Conventions Against Torture and the Genocide Convention, and also the Palermo Protocol on Human Trafficking. And just some additional treaties are the Conventions of the Rights of the Child, treaties on refugees and internally displaced persons, and other very important international commitments include the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and the Millennium Development Goals. And again, there's much more information on all of these in the toolkit, but I think it's important for everybody to be aware that these exist. And we also have very important regional instruments. For instance, in Africa, in the Great Lakes region, we looked at a couple of bodies that have been very important. The African Union, especially through its Maputo Protocol on women's rights, is one of the most comprehensive instruments on women's rights that I've seen, and it's been very useful for advocates. Of course, the implementation is always the issue, but advocates are working very hard in using that as a tool. And the International Conference of the Great Lakes region also contains a lot of provisions on women's rights, and these bodies have really been informed by their experience in conflict and the conflict in these countries, so they really do address and include some of the provisions of 1325. So those kind of personal experiences are very important. And then the toolkit talks about leveraging international and regional instruments, and a couple of my favorite quotes came from George Ofoyiro of the Uganda Human Rights Commission. First he said, "One cannot talk about human rights without talking about the international instruments. And when you drum something into people's minds over and over, it's bound to stick." So really that knowledge of the instruments and the constant advocacy is really important. And I say use the international law strategically because, again, as we just saw, there are a lot of them available to us. Sometimes we only hear about 1325 or CEDAW, but there's a whole body that's available to us. And it's also important to think about our audiences and look at which ones will work and won't work. And just a note on challenging the notion of a Western concept. You often hear, especially when you're working in some of these conflict-affected areas, that human rights or women's rights are Western concepts. So it's really important to note that the Women, Peace, and Security Framework is the result of the efforts of women's groups, and especially those affected by conflict, and that it was an effort supported by women and governments from around the world, and that thus is not just a Western concept. And the background of 1325 is discussed more in the toolkit, but this is a very important part of advocacy and countering those kinds of cultural arguments. Part 2 of the toolkit looks at best practices and strategies for linking the women, peace, and security agenda to the rule of law. Now, the most effective way to ensure implementation of international obligations is through domestication, which is the inclusion of human rights principles into domestic legal systems, including constitutions, national law, and institutions. And this part shows how to do that. And the first entry point is through a constitution, because this is the base of a country's legal system and really the basis of all advocacy. countries in conflict or transition and emerging democracies are often going through their constitution writing processes, and this is the time to really get these key points in. And I just want to speak briefly to the cases of Uganda and Rwanda, and again, these are included in the toolkit in the case studies, but just to talk briefly about their processes. In Uganda, when democracy was restored in 1986, due to the populist nature of the government and the country's turbulent experiences of the prior 2 decades of conflict, as well as the grave human rights abuses and the lack of democratic governance by previous governments, the government sought to create an inclusive, democratic, and safeguarded constitution. One of the first tasks of the reconstruction process was for the government to regain international legitimacy, and in doing so, it looked to international law, recognizing international human rights standards and integrating these standards into the country's legal framework. As a result, the Ugandan Constitution is a virtual replica of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and subsequent human rights treaties to which Uganda is a party. And very importantly, the inclusion of 2 strong, knowledgeable women lawyers on the Constitutional Commission and the additional advice of expert lawyers who were familiar with the international conventions were key to the outcome of the constitutional process, as these individuals were able to really articulate Uganda's international obligations and advocate for a constitution that included human rights and women's rights. And women's organizations really facilitated the involvement of women in constitution building processes. They held gender dialogues and workshops, and women were able to express the concerns about their rights to own land and inherit property, to have custody of their children, about violence against women and lack of access to education, credit, land, and employment. And women working on the proposals for the new constitution referred specifically to CEDAW's concepts of equality to advocate for inclusion of these principles, and this is reflected in a number of key provisions in the Constitution. And then further, in 2003, a review of the Constitution was held, and women's groups were consulted during the process, and having seen the workings of CEDAW and also at that point being armed with Resolution 1325, they were further able to advocate for women's rights. And Rwanda also held a similar comprehensive constitution writing process in 2003, and women's groups were really included, and in their lobby efforts, they leveraged the international instruments such as the International Bill of Rights and CEDAW, stressing the government's obligations as state parties and their duties to report under these instruments. So again, the result is a constitution that incorporates the principles of gender equality and the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, and provides a strong legal framework for mainstreaming gender. So these are some good examples of how this can be done. And up on the screen here we have a list of some of the specific rights that should be included in constitutions, and we're going to get to those now under the laws, because again, it's the best thing to do is have these rights included in the Constitution as the basis of your advocacy. But the next step is to get these provisions and these rights into laws, because a key part of the prevention pillar under 1325, which is preventing abuse and violation of women's rights, is strengthening women's rights under international law. So including laws related to gender equality and women's rights are an important way of embedding the women, peace, and security framework into the rule of law. And the toolkit gives a list of the type of laws we should be looking at, how to advocate for them, using international and regional obligations, as well as obligations under national constitutions. And knowing these principles really allows us to advocate more effectively. So I'm going to just move fairly quickly for time reasons through the types of laws we're looking at. One is political participation laws. a lot of countries have included quotas, the number of women that need to be in governance, which has been really important in bringing women to the table. But we've seen, too, that preparing women leaders is really key. So it's not just about having them there. It's they need to know what to say and how to advocate around these issues. And that's important, as we know, here in the country. That's part of, in the U.S., that's part of what WAND does to empower women politically. Laws addressing gender-based violence are critical everywhere, because gender-based violence obviously has a lot of consequences on women, on families, on communities. There are psychological, health consequences, economic consequences. So it's really important to address those issues in the law. Family laws are important because in many countries women are really discriminated against in areas of marriage, of divorce, child custody. There are a lot of instances of early and forced marriage. Dowry and bride price are problems that often lead to further discrimination and gender-based violence in areas. Customary marriages, which are not necessarily recognized under a law and do not provide protection, and then polygamy also needs to be addressed. And then children's rights are important to address, especially in some of these conflict areas where we've seen that children are being recruited as child soldiers, as sex slaves, and being trafficked. So it's really important to address those issues. Social and economic empowerment laws are really important, and as part of what we'll be hearing from Representative Melin, because those are ongoing issues everywhere. And the social and economic empowerment of women has lagged behind, but again, as I was saying before, it's really important to recognize the importance of women in development. As seen in the case studies, Rwanda has been a really great model for mainstreaming gender into all of its development efforts, and that is one of the reasons that they have had some success in furthering gender equality. Land rights issues are very important in a lot of these countries, as I mentioned. Education laws, healthcare laws, employment laws. Again, those are even applicable here in the U.S., as we're going to hear about. Citizenship and nationality laws, making sure that women do not have to depend on their husbands for their citizenship. They can have their own citizenship. They can pass citizenship onto their children. Addressing refugees and internally displaced persons is really important, because so many people are being displaced by conflict, and women and children especially are very vulnerable in these situations to sexual harassment and other issues. And just a couple of points that are related to laws and implementing the policy framework. One is national action plans, which are national policies that detail how government bodies and stakeholders that are tasked with security, foreign policy, development, and gender equality will actually carry out 1325 principles, both within their countries and in their foreign policies during times of both peace and conflict. Although they don't carry the weight of law, they do offer a tool for governments to articulate priorities and coordinate the implementation of 1325 and outline specific steps that countries will take. And thus they are really important guidelines for governments, as well as strong tools for advocates to hold their governments accountable. Also, once in place, they can be used as leverage to lobby lawmakers to pass legislation necessary to carry out the goals of these national action plans and the Women, Peace, and Security Framework, and make them permanent, legally binding obligations. And that's one thing that we at WAND and with other groups are working here in the United States, because we do have a national action plan which is issued by executive order, but it is while it creates obligations for the U.S. Department of State and Agency for International Development and Department of Defense and others to really include women and gender perspectives in all of our diplomatic, development, and defense efforts. Again, it is not law, so we really want to see that be made permanent through the law. And just a note on institutions, because government institutions are really essential in carrying out law and policy. One of the major challenges identified in the case studies include educating institutions on gender issues. And in order for the Women, Peace, and Security framework to become and remain embedded, institutions must be established to promote and be vigilant for the laws, and they also need to understand these frameworks and their obligations. That includes working with these kinds of institutions in post-conflict systems, setting them up, but also the kind of work that we do here at WAND, working with Congress, with the administration, with Department of State, USAID, to really make sure that these institutions understand their obligations and are really including women and gender equality principles in all of their efforts. I'm going to just move forward a little bit due to time. I won't talk too much about justice. This is discussed in the toolkit, but obviously setting up effective justice systems, as I said, is very important, especially when you're dealing with areas that have been through conflict or going through transition, because often their justice systems are destroyed or have little capacity. And as I mentioned, even in areas that have not experienced conflict, even in our own country, we need to work with the justice system, with law enforcement, with judges and lawyers to understand how to address gender issues, for instance, gender-based violence and things like that. So I just want to mention that Part 3 of the toolkit talks about strengthening the rule of law and access to justice for women through working with communities. And for me, this is a really, really key part of all of this, because having laws on the books is just a first step. But without proper implementation, they remain words on paper and really don't change the lives of women and men on the ground. Two of the biggest overall challenges identified in the case studies include changing perceptions and educating institutions and working with traditional cultures. In order to really bring about change, we need to work with those cultures and institutions that have allowed the discrimination to exist. Having laws in place is important, but they won't work unless there are changes in the structural and institutional forces that bring about inequality in the first place. And working at the cultural and grassroots level is critical in preventing conflict and promoting rights and in connecting the law to the people. And so this part of the toolkit looks at some of the programs and strategies identified in the case studies that have been successful in working with communities to implement laws on gender equality and women's rights. And this includes working with traditional religious and cultural leaders who really are often the gateways to their communities, and it's really important to work with them to change perceptions. And the next speaker is going to speak more about this, so I won't say too much. And also working with communities really at the grassroots level is important. Working with men and women in communities to educate them about their rights and related laws, and to promote peace and equality within communities is really key. And I did want to talk about some of the experiences working with groups on the ground there, but we're running out of time, so I'll let you all read about them in the toolkit. I'll just leave you with my contact information, and again, anybody who would like more information or trainings or discussions on this, please feel free to contact me. And I'm going to now pass this over to Nageeba Hassan, who's joining us from Kampala, Uganda, hopefully is still connected on the line. She has been doing some really great innovative work working with Muslim communities and interfaith communities, so I will have her talk about that. Nageeba?
Yes, Julie.
Hi. Would you like to tell us about your work?
Miss Julie, this is Nageeba Hassan from Uganda. I work with Ugandan Muslim Supreme Council. I work also with the Interreligious Council of Uganda. Restoring and empowering communities. This is a community-based initiative. With the Ugandan Muslim Supreme Council, I think I'm the first woman to get a post at the national level in the office. And it's tough because Uganda Muslim Supreme Council is dominated by men, and the constitution does not provide like women alongside with men. But when I was given a chance to work with the national office, I felt we should have the women at all the levels up to the grassroots. And that was very tough because some of the men were not happy that a woman has been given an office. And I knew that getting the ladies on board is going to be tough because either the men were seeing it as a threat to them or not right, or the religion doesn't provide for that. And I had to do it peacefully with them. So I had a dialogue with my bosses and requested that they write letters to the religious leaders at the district level to nominate a woman at that level who would be like the contact person for Ugandan Muslim Supreme Council, and I'll be in touch with them like from the national level, because if I went to do that in the community, the religious leaders would never support them. They would see it like a power struggle or something. And so I thought if the religious leaders themselves nominate these ladies, then they'll be able to give them support. And that's how 50 the whole of Uganda, and we have over 300 counties, we have over 10,000 mosques. And so we have women at all those levels, but nominated by religious leaders or men at those levels. And then they get support the women if we want. I was in a big association of over 200 women or 300 women, and just doing basically religious work, like teaching themselves the religious work, the Quran and the Hadiths, that's the traditions. But they're not doing much of developmental work. And then I had to find a way of having dialogues with the women in the community, and we kind of discussed on how they can do different works, like about peace, about health, about education, agriculture, but in smaller groups, manageable numbers like 25 to 30 members. And they encourage them to register their organizations with the local districts, so that they are like known and not doing work that seems to be not known. And with the issues of terrorism, people need to know who you are and what you're doing. So I advise them to do that, to register themselves with government, and most of them did, and they're doing great work. My desk or department of Ugandan Muslim Supreme Council is not funded, so these people have to, the women have to look for their own funding. What I can do is, if I get information about who is funding what, which embassy is doing what, which organization is doing what. I pass on that information to the people in the community, and I've encouraged them a lot to partner with people in their own community, the organizations that come to work in the community, so they partner with them. They have this attitude of not working with people who are not Muslims, and that's one of the main reasons why I joined Ugandan Muslim Supreme Council, because I was working with the school for 8 years. When I left the school, I joined the community work, and I was working with an organization called Reach the Children. It's funded by Americans, and they are Christian. So when I used to go to the community to teach, it was prevention of HIV, and the Muslims never came for those sessions because it was funded by Christians, and they think Christians have their own motives. They want them to convert to Christianity. So I kept telling them, but I'm a Muslim. Do you expect me to teach you things that are not right according to your religion or to my own religion? But they couldn't listen. And yet HIV doesn't choose who it gets or who it doesn't get. And that's how I joined Ugandan Muslim Supreme Council, basically to help the women on developmental issues. I thought working with them directly, then I'll be able to help them more than working with another organization that they already have they're biased about and that. But that is changing a lot now, because we've had a lot of sensitization. Uganda Muslim Supreme Council, the Constitution does not provide for women to be in the leadership like.
Nageeba, I think you're cutting out now, so I want to just mention.
And the Uganda Muslim Supreme Council Constitution. Hello. The Uganda Muslim Supreme Council does not.
Hi. Hi everyone. Sorry, I think Nageeba's cutting out. It's a little bit difficult with the connection over there in Uganda, but I just wanted to just follow up on the great work that she's doing. Let's see if I can pop this up here and just show really quickly one of the things I was very impressed with when we were over there is she talked about putting these principles in terms that communities can relate to. So for instance, they put together this integrated module on the prevention of violence against women and children from an Islamic perspective. And it really goes through, I just copied a few of the pages. For instance, it talks about, it goes through all the different rights related to women. This one is peace and harmony in the family. It talks about here the international human rights. You've got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and others, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and then it talks about perceptions in Islam about the family, and then it actually takes provisions of the Quran and it talks about equality and what these provisions are really saying and how they've been misconstrued, but how Islam really looks at equality between men and women. So this is really innovative work, and I think really an important example of how to work with communities, which can be very challenging. So thank you to Nageeba for her comments all the way from Kampala late in the evening. And anyone who would like to follow up with her, please be in contact with me. She's wonderful, and I'd be happy to connect you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Minnesota State Representative Carly Melin to talk a little bit about some laws that have been recently passed in Minnesota.
Hi, thanks for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, I just wanted to go through some of the recently passed legislation in Minnesota dealing with a lot of women's issues. What we did here in Minnesota was really put together a comprehensive package called the Women's Economic Security Act, which our governor, Governor Dayton, actually signed into law on Mother's Day of this year. And the way that we were able to get the legislation passed was several different authors in the Minnesota House and the Minnesota Senate carried bills individually, and then we put them together in one big package towards the end of session, really trying to address income inequality between men and women and some other inequalities that we've seen in the state and of course nationwide, and tried to really address some of those issues. So the first part of the Women's Economic Security Act allows mothers to stay in the workforce by expanding family leave and providing reasonable accommodations for pregnant and nursing employees. We know on a federal level, women are guaranteed 12 weeks of unpaid leave upon the birth or adoption of a child, but that's only if you have 50 or more employees. And so here in Minnesota, we had 6 weeks leave if you had the less than 50 employees, and we have now increased that to 12 weeks. So here in Minnesota now, you're guaranteed 12 weeks leave for the birth or adoption of a child, which of course we think is really important to be able to have that time. I have a newborn myself, so it's very important to be home during that time. We also required employers with 21 or more employees to provide reasonable accommodations for pregnant workers, including seating changes, food and water, access, limits to heavy lifting, and even transfer of position. So if a pregnant worker has a labor-intensive job or she's on her feet a lot, employers are now required to provide accommodations for that worker, including a change of position temporarily while she's pregnant to accommodate her in the interest of her health and, of course, the health of the unborn child. We also now provide enforcement for workplace protections for nursing mothers to express milk during their unpaid break times. So this provides mothers who are breastfeeding the rights and protections to be able to express milk while they're at work, so that they cannot face retribution from their employer for being a nursing mother. We also are attempting to close the gender pay gap between men and women in a couple of different ways. One of those ways is by some one-time grants that we put in place that expand support for employers, workforce organizations, and others to recruit, prepare, and place women in non-traditional occupations, especially targeting low-income and older women to make sure we try to get them into higher earning occupations. And by doing that, we provided funding to 2 women's organizations in Minnesota in order to do the outreach to those low-income and older women and get them trained into higher income jobs. Another way that we're attempting to close the income gap between men and women in Minnesota is we provided new enforcement for equal pay laws. And one of those is that we now require businesses that contract with the state and have 40 or more employees to certify that they are in compliance with equal pay laws. And the state now has the right to audit those businesses to make sure that they're in compliance with equal pay laws. This is similar to what President Obama did at the federal level, where he's now requiring federal contractors to pay an increased minimum wage and be compliant with equal pay laws. We're doing that at a state level. So what we're saying is if you contract with the state of Minnesota, then you have to be paying men and women equally. So we think that that's going to do a lot to address the pay gap between men and women. We also passed a sort of state version of the Lilly Ledbetter Act to make sure that employees can discuss their compensation without fear of retaliation from their employers. So that's the scenario where employees are simply able to ask their coworkers how much they're making to make sure that they are being compensated equally as their male counterparts. We also are addressing the gender pay gap by addressing what's known as the motherhood penalty. We know that women who have children are less likely to get promotions, less likely to get raises than even women who don't have children or their male counterparts. So we are addressing that by requiring equal employment treatment for pregnant women and parents, meaning that women with children and women who are expecting a child cannot be discriminated against in the workplace. We also allow grandparents to use existing earned sick leave to help with care for an ill or injured grandchild. So again, allowing, we know that women are primary caretakers, and so this is allowing grandparents to use their sick leave to care for their ill or injured grandchild. We also wanted to address the economic consequences of domestic violence, stalking, and sexual assault. That's a component that we often don't think of when we think of those things, but the fact of the matter is a lot of women are unable to leave their abuser because of the economic dependence that they have on their abuser. So we wanted to make sure that we address that very serious issue, and we did that by expanding unemployment insurance eligibility currently available to victims of domestic violence to include victims of stalking and sexual assault. And we also allow employees to use their sick leave to deal with sexual assault, domestic violence, or stalking. And that's a really important way for women to know that they can become independent from their abuser and not suffer consequences at work and have opportunities to secure themselves financially so that they are able to distance themselves from their abuser. We also wanted to make sure that we addressed the fact that women are much more likely to live in poverty after retirement and oftentimes have a lot less saved up for retirement than men do, even if they've been working the same amount of time. So we are requiring a state agency to do a report on retired workers in Minnesota and to make sure that workers have access to workplace retirement savings plans and other alternatives so that women can be secure in their retirement. So those were a lot of the components of the Women's Economic Security Act that we were able to pass into law here in Minnesota. I think we're really making great strides as far as making sure that women have workplace protections and are getting paid the same as their male counterparts. Another thing we were able to do here in Minnesota was increase the minimum wage. We know the federal minimum wage is only $7.25 an hour, and we just increased the minimum wage in Minnesota to $9.50 an hour. And one of the reasons I think that's really important for women is here and nationwide, women are more likely to be minimum wage earners than men. In fact, here 2/3 of minimum wage earners are women. And so by increasing the minimum wage, those workers will be seeing a bigger paycheck and be able to support themselves and their families better in that regard. So, we were able to, fortunately, the stars aligned with our legislature this year and a governor who was very supportive of these initiatives, and we were able to really make a lot of progress in dealing with women's economic security. And there's still more work to be done, but I'm proud of what we were able to do this past session and would be happy to answer any questions when we're done here.
Thank you so much, Representative Melin. That was really, really in-depth and thorough. And also thank you to Nageeba Hassan. You both are doing really, really great work, and we appreciate you sharing that with us. I'm sure the audience has lots of questions. Before we take questions, I just wanted to remind you how to submit them. Please type your questions into the panel on the right-hand side of your screen in the question box. They'll come to me, and I'll ask them out loud. I know several of you have asked if you can get the information shared in the slides, and if this webinar is being recorded, and the answer to both of those questions is yes. They'll be posted on our website at wan.org, where you can download the materials after the presentation. So now we're going to take some questions from the audience. Our first question is from Sheila Scanlon. Sheila asks, how do you harmonize the justice system when the Constitution gives equality to women and law support the Constitution, but both are contrary to Sharia law? And Julie, I'm not sure if maybe you want to take a stab at that one.
Yeah, so it's definitely a challenge, and certainly something that's addressed in the toolkit is how to do that. And you know, the best way to do it is to say that, to recognize customary or Sharia law to the extent that it does not go against the Constitution or human rights principles or the law of the land. Now, of course, it varies in different situations and with different countries and what the laws actually are. And, of course, you can have those provisions in place, but what's happening on the ground might be very different, even though these things are in law, in principle. So, again, that's where it's really important to work with these communities and really work with traditional religious leaders on these principles and to educate them and to sensitize them on gender issues and really the importance of you know, including women and women's rights and gender equality. And it's certainly tough. It's probably one of the biggest challenges that people face, especially where these strict systems are very strict, but really continuing to try to make those inroads is key.
Thank you, Julie. Our next question is for Representative Melin. The question is from Kimberly Otis. Kimberly asks, does Minnesota have a quota for the percentage of women in non-traditional jobs?
That's a good question, and no, we don't have a quota, but we are, like I said, we passed a couple of grants to try to get women trained and placed in non-traditional jobs. I happen to represent a rural part of Minnesota that's very heavy in industry, in the mining industry, as a matter of fact, and it's a industry that's dominated by men. Women traditionally haven't worked in the mining industry. And so, you know, for a number of years now, we've actually worked pretty closely with the companies to get more women into those jobs because they are high income jobs, and that also includes getting them the right education. And so there are several state programs available to make sure that we get women the right training that they need to get into those higher income jobs, but no specific quota available.
Thank you. And now before we end, I'm going to turn it back over to Julie Orosky.
Thank you, Etsy, and thanks again, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you to our speakers. I think it's really great to hear from you know, a broad spectrum of perspectives and areas of the world, and it really brings home to me you know, how parallel some of these processes are. You know, the toolkit, and a lot of my work is centered around working in conflict areas and international work, but listening to Representative Melin talk about the state law in Minnesota, you realize not only that we still have some ways to go, but also there are parallel issues, women's economic empowerment, pay gaps, issues with domestic violence. So really they are issues that we're facing everywhere in developed countries, in conflict and peaceful countries. And really, you know, when we talk about women, peace, and security, we're talking globally and as far as conflict, but we're also talking about peace and security within communities, and that's incredibly important to always bring that back home. And there were several things I didn't get to. As Aziz said, the materials, the slides will be available on the website, and of course the entire toolkit is there. But I just have up on my screen, if people can still see it, a few of the final recommendations around advocating for laws, and I'll just go through them briefly. One is to know and use the 1325 framework, and that includes all of the things that I've mentioned today, from the Security Council resolutions to the international laws to national laws, again using them very strategically. Being able to articulate the effects of gender-based violence and discrimination against women and girls on individuals, families, communities, and national development. Again, really looking at the effects of all this and really looking pragmatically on why we need to change gender perspectives and gender norms and really have gender equality. Garnering support for bills through awareness raising. You know, that's a lot of what we do. We're working with policymakers, but also really bringing that down to the grassroots level so that people know what is happening, but also working with, as I said, with religious, with cultural leaders to get people on board with these issues. Countering cultural arguments, which I had mentioned, is key because that's so much of what is often justifying the discrimination. The more we can engage in human rights education, the more we can talk about these instruments, the more we can talk about human rights, the more we can educate people about their rights and how to advocate for them, the more power they will have. And then a couple of technical issues when it comes to laws is advocating for funding mechanisms and establishing effective monitoring mechanisms, because again, just having laws in place isn't enough. We have to make sure that they're funded and that they're monitored and they will be followed through. So I just wanted to, you know, take one last look at that slide. And again, thank you to everyone. And I am here for any follow-up questions or trainings or anything that people would like to contact me about, and I look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. Once again, the materials will be emailed to you after this webinar. Please be sure to fill out the survey, which will appear once you exit the webinar. We really appreciate your feedback and you know, want your input on how to continue improving our webinar program. Thank you again to our presenters, and with that, we will conclude the webinar.